Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Today is May 7th, 2024, and tonight we'll be doing a class on the Easter Rebellion. If for those uninitiated, this is the Easter Uprising in Ireland in 1916, done by the Irish Citizens Army, made famous through James Connolly in his writings. So we'll have a brief history of Ireland, as well as a brief history of Irish republicanism. We will have a section about the Easter Rebellion itself, the battles around it, and the aftermath and reactions to the battle. And for this, I will be turning now over to the head of the Irish Commission of the PCUSA. Comrade, you have the floor.
All right, so first a little bit of backstory as far as what the situation was. So Ireland was under control of the British. In 1109, the Normans attempted to conquer Ireland. They were only partially successful. Gaelic culture and the Irish reasserted themselves by 1494. English control had disappeared in England completely outside an area surrounding Dublin called the Pale. Henry VII in 1536 decided to conquer Ireland and thus began a series of bloody struggles, Desmond rebellions, the 9 Years' War. By 1603, England had conquered Ireland. There were subsequent rebellions in the 17th century, with the reconquest of Ireland by Oliver Cromwell being the most brutal of the repressions committed by England. At the turn of the century, since conquest by Britain, many land holdings were confiscated and given to Protestant loyalists or settlers. Penal laws prohibited Catholics from holding office and restricted rights. Many Irish were Catholic peasants that were exploited by loyalist landholders. Penal laws also saw many Irish transported to Barbados and the Caribbean for indentured servitude. From the 16th to the 19th century, Ireland was a colony of England. In 1800, the Act of Union created the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The majority of land was owned by English absentee landlords by the 19th century. The general populace suffered from discriminatory policies, famines, including the Great Famine of 1841 to 1845. The beginnings to Irish liberation. At first barred from holding public office, Irish Catholics gained the right to join Parliament in 1832, but there was a property requirement that barred most Irish citizens. Attempts at home rule were tried in the mid-century, but most parliamentary measures failed. Rebellions in the 19th century against English rule continued and were put down violently. 1803, Robert Emmet; 1848, the Young Irelanders; 1867, Irish Republican Brotherhood. The land question was beginning to be addressed by the end of the 19th century, with the large landholdings broken up, but power was mostly with those who held property. And there was a split between Irish nationalists and Irish unionists. And really quick, that home rule was really the precursor to that was the main political effort before the Easter Rising. It's very similar to our what the struggle was here in America with our War of Independence, more than 100 years beforehand. But it was almost like it was all about representation within the existing British Parliament. They weren't going to rule themselves. They weren't going to have their own government. But the main push was just to have some sort of representation in the British Parliament. That's pretty much what Home Rule was, and that was everything that was focused on before the Easter Rising. So James Connolly he came on the scene, and he was born in Ireland, but grew up in Scotland for most of his childhood. He left school when he was 10 years old and started working, but then he joined the British Army when he was 14 years old. He did it partially because his brother joined the British Army, and he spent those formative years from age 14 to 21 in the British Army. And it's not completely known where he was, but he was definitely deployed in Ireland as a British soldier for a chunk of that time. And he deserted in 1889, and it's widely considered that it's because he was about to be deployed to India, but I have heard that that's a myth. He also met his wife, Lily Pendergast, at that time and married her, who was a Protestant. And I think that's probably a contributing factor to why he deserted. And we could definitely and should do an entire class on James Connolly and his ideology. But basically, he was a major socialist organizer with the Scottish Socialist Federation and the Irish Socialist Republican Party. Also, um, illustrious trade unionist with the IWW in America and the Irish Transport and General Workers Union in Belfast, as well as a major strike organizer with that union. And he also didn't drink. But to sum up real quick is he was he was active around the same time as Lenin and immersed in Marxism, and him and Lenin were essentially using Marxism, coming to the same sort of conclusions as far as how to build a republic, a workers' republic, to summarize very quickly. Next slide, please. So, in order to develop a rebellion, one of the things to understand about Connolly's activities is they didn't just use the Irish Citizens Army. It was a united front between socialist and non-socialist forces. So first there was the Irish Citizens Army of 200 to 250 men, and they were working class defensive militia, and that's essentially what they did is they were a defensive armed organization to protect strike efforts and Catholics. Then you had the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Oh, by the way, the starry plow there is the Irish Citizens Army. Um, and then that sun there, this is going in order, by the way, um, was the Irish Republican Brotherhood. They were not socialist, but they were devoted to national liberation for Ireland. And they weren't even really a militia themselves, but they would infiltrate other militias in order to push them to that end, like the Irish Volunteer Force. The Irish Volunteer Force formed in response to what was called the Ulster Volunteers. And not to get too deep into it, but the Ulster Volunteers formed in order to prevent home rule. It was a bunch of unionist, loyalist people in Ireland who didn't even want representation. And they formed a militia to make sure that home rule never happened. So the Irish Volunteer Force formed in response to the Ulster Forces volunteering in order to be a militia that did seek home rule. And that was what the main movement was at the time leading up to World War One. And then the British were like, "Oh, we'll give you home rule. We'll give you home rule," like dangling that in front of Ireland. And then World War One happened, and they're like, "Forget about it. We've got a world war to fight. Maybe we'll talk about home rule once we're done." Home rule was off the table then, and many people in the Irish Volunteer Force went and joined the British forces in order to fight in World War One. And they also had a women's auxiliary, which is that flag in the bottom right hand corner, which was an all women's auxiliary, which I can't remember the pronunciation right now, but it does mean the Women's Council. So they were involved in this, and there you go. Yep.
Thank you. So we will now stop for a round of discussion and questionings. Please use the raise hand function if you have a question or comment. Just a couple of comments for the pronunciation you were wondering about for the Women's Council. It's Commemoration. But there's actually the song The Man from the Daily Mail has a section about them. And then also just a note earlier, the history of exploitation, especially after England took over Ireland, it was used as an agricultural output. In particular, the 1841-45 famine, which is also known as the Great Potato Famine, that was exacerbated by policies that the British had imposed on Ireland at the time. And where also have we heard about absentee landlords holding large lands and then charging rent off people that they never actually see. So with that aside, you have your hand up, you have the floor. Go ahead.
I know a little bit about the Connolly situation. I don't know exactly, but what happened was he saw the Fenian uprising of 1887, and that had a lot to do with what kind of formed him. I don't know what the straw that broke the camel's back that made him desert the British Army, but yeah.
Thank you, comrade. And just a quick reminder as well, please try to limit your comments to 90 seconds and also about the topic of discussion for tonight. Comrade, you have the floor.
Yes, so comrades, in 2016, I went to Ireland, to Dublin, as a part of the Korean Friendship Association. Their international meeting was held there, and the comrades in Dublin brought us around the historical sites, and I recommend comrades go there. And it's interesting because they're white people who technically speak English, but they know all about imperialism. And James Connolly, I've been to where he was executed, the prison. So it is said there among the people, and our class will go into this further, the timing of his uprising was wrong because they did it during World War I, and the British said he was a German spy, and so they killed him. And what they did is they so brutally killed these people, it inspired the later uprisings. But anyways, as mentioned, Comrade Connolly was a contemporary of Lenin. This is the time of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And the post office in Dublin, where the comrades made their last stand fighting the British, if you go there today, there's a giant banner, like mural of Lenin. This is in a Western country. You'll never see that anywhere else in the world. And you talk to people on the street, and they will tell you things like I'm saying. It's really quite an experience. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade.
Yeah, that women's organization still exists today as well. They still do demonstrations occasionally. And I believe in the Troubles, they supported the Continuity IRA, that organization, which I don't know much about that particular one. Yeah, a lot of these organizations still exist, actually. Most of them still exist in some form.
Thank you, comrade. Yes, we'll be definitely touching on some of the history of the Irish War of Independence a little later.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I think it's interesting that the Eastern Rebellion wasn't necessarily, at least maybe I'm incorrect about this, but not necessarily a socialist revolution as much as it was a national liberation rebellion. And the fact that communists today, still these national liberation movements in the United States, the American Revolution, it's not a socialist revolution, but it is still important. The way Earl Browder, the head of the Communist Party, said that the CPUSA was inheriting these revolutionary traditions, despite them not being necessarily socialist.
Thank you for that. One important thing to note as well is James Connolly wanted an Ireland for Ireland and the Irish, because he said, unless we break ourselves from the banks and whatnot, we'll still be tied to England. Only a socialist Ireland can be truly free.
Yes. Also, you forgot to mention the 1798 rebellion or Wolf Tone.
No, thank you. There are many rebellions by the Irish over the English, because they were definitely not welcome on the Emerald Isle.
Thank you. I just find it a bit ironic that Cromwell, the guy that stood for progression against the king, was also the most brutal in Ireland. Go figure. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, so before Cromwell reconquered Ireland, there was about 8.8 million. By the end of that, the population was almost literally cut in half with how many people had been killed and displaced, as well as there was also people starving from that conflict as well. And I think by 1650, Cromwell had deported almost 20,000 Irish to the Barbados and the Caribbean as indentured servants. So he really did not like the Irish.
This is Ephraim, and
Go ahead.
since I know the struggle, the just struggle of the Irish people for centuries, and it was even supported by Karl Marx. But the Karl Marx position in regard to Ireland was qualified. He kind of supported the independence movement, but at the same time, since the Irish and the British and the Scots, they have so much in common as a race and as exploited masses. I think Karl Marx was into using the Irish struggle to weaken the capitalist class in England. But my question is that isn't it possible for the Irish people and the British people and all the other peoples in United Kingdom unite and get rid of international capitalism right there, and then maybe settle for an independent Ireland without the exploitation of man by man? Isn't that feasible to our movement?
So for the time when all of this was going on, England itself was embroiled in the First World War, fighting for global domination against Germany. At this time as well, there were also conscriptions going on that were threatening to go through in Ireland in 1918, especially, which later on actually became, as well as the anger that the populace had against the put down of the Easter Rebellion, as part of the reason that the IRA was founded and an independent government was declared, and that's when the Irish War of Independence started. But it would be great if all of the people could come together to throw off international capitalism. There's definitely, though, a long history that would have to get worked out through first before that. But yeah. Hearing nothing, we will return to the presentation. Our second section is going to be about the battle itself.
So this next section, this is the original plan. Intended to take control of Dublin and other cities, including railways and ports. There had been drilling regularly, and once the rebellion started, British forces were caught off guard because the drills were commonplace. Contact had been made with Germany to provide a shipment of arms from a German U-boat. After major cities and infrastructure were captured, Irish rebel forces would declare the Irish Republic. Beginning of World War I instigated the best opportunity to strike because most British forces would be involved, provided a now or never situation. Doomed from the start. The German U-boat carrying arms and supplies was intercepted and shuttled. Eoin MacNeill of the Irish Volunteers caught wind of the news and ordered his forces to stay home on Easter Sunday. The rest of the Irish rebel forces agreed to go ahead anyway on the following Monday, April 24th. They had over 2,000 rebels in Ireland and 1,200 in Dublin. The greatest advantage was surprise despite all of the setbacks. The rebel forces successfully seized key locations in Dublin by midday on Monday. 400 volunteers occupied the General Post Office. This was commanded by James Connolly. Also included Patrick Pearse, Tom Clark, Sean MacDiarmada, and Joseph Plunkett. Pierce reads the Proclamation of the Irish Republic.
And so our next section is going to be a video. This is from a commemoration, and this is one of the troops reading out the proclamation that you see on the right of the screen.
Oblach na hÉireann, the Provisional Government of the Irish Republic. To the people of Ireland, Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and the dead generations from which she draws her old traditions of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. Having organised and trained her manhood through her secret revolutionary organisation, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and through her open military organisations, the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army, having patiently perfected her discipline, having resolutely waited for the right moment to reveal itself, she now seizes that moment. And supported by her exiled children in America and by gallant allies in Europe, but relying in the first on her own strength, she strikes in full confidence of victory. We declare the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies to be sovereign and indefeasible. The long usurpation of that right by a foreign people and government has not extinguished the right, nor can it ever be extinguished, except by the destruction of the Irish people. In every generation, the Irish people have asserted their right to freedom and sovereignty. 6 times during the past 300 years, they have asserted it in arms. Standing on that fundamental right, and again asserting it in arms in the face of the world, we hereby proclaim the Irish Republic as a sovereign, independent state. And we pledge our lives and the lives of our comrades in arms to the cause of its freedom, to its welfare, and of its exaltation among the nations. The Irish Republic is entitled to, and hereby claims, the allegiance of every Irish man and Irish woman. The Republic guarantees religious and civil liberty, equal rights, equal opportunities to all its citizens, and declares its resolve to pursue the happiness and prosperity of the whole nation and of all its parts, cherishing all the children of the nation equally, and oblivious to the differences carefully fostered by an alien government, which have divided a minority from the majority in the past. Until our arms have brought the opportune moment for the establishment of a permanent national government, representative of the whole people of Ireland, and elected by the suffrages of all her men and women, the provisional government, hereby constituted, will administer the civil and military affairs of the Republic in trust for the people. We place the cause of the Irish Republic under the protection of the Most High God, whose blessing we invoke upon our arms, and we pray no one who serves that cause will dishonor it by cowardice, inhumanity, or rapine. In this supreme hour, the Irish nation must, by its valor and discipline, and by the readiness of its children to sacrifice themselves for the common good, prove itself worthy of the august destiny to which it is called. Signed on behalf of the Provisional Government, Thomas J. Clarke, Sean McDermott, Thomas McDonough, P.H. Pearce, Eamon Kent, James Connolly, Joseph Plunkett,
Okay, British forces react. The British forces arrived in Dublin by 4 p.m. on Monday. They were greeted by the locals as heroes. Many soldiers were Irish working class men, just like the rebels. Over 20,000 strong by the end of the rebellion. And this included artillery, Maxim machine guns, and gunboat. Irish rebels defended their positions comparable to the Battle of Thermopylae or the Alamo. A necessary sacrifice. James Connolly was mortally wounded on Thursday. The surrender occurred on Friday, April 28th, and fighting ceased on Saturday, April 29th. They were fighting a superior military force, and trying to hold key buildings and infrastructure was an impossible task. The rebellion leaders knew the battle would be doomed, but decided to go ahead with it anyways. Michael Collins would successfully use guerrilla tactics instead during the Irish War of Independence.
All right. Thank you for that. And we will go to our next round of questions.
I don't know how many people realize how important this was to us as communists. I don't think I realized it until tonight. I remember what Lenin said, every war of a people has to go through two stages. The first stage, a war of national independence. The second stage of socialist revolution. That's straight Lenin. Many of these countries had to go through a national liberation movement. I think it's important to realize that. It's also important to understand how in all these national liberation movements, you'll have communists. Even in, there was no such thing as communists at a certain period of time, people who were of that background. Anybody who defended the working class and came from that background and participated in national liberation was close to us ideologically. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo.
Yeah, so a couple things. Like, it's hard to overstate kind of how shaky this whole thing was, because not only did the U-boat get sank, but their coalition was already starting to fall apart once that guy McNeil found out about it. Also, in my research, they got him involved by, and I can double check this source if you want me to, but they got him involved by providing a false letter from the British that said that they were all going to be arrested soon. So they kind of tricked that guy of the Irish Volunteer Force to get involved, because they didn't want anything to do with national liberation or socialism. They were just trying to get representation. And then I mean, the whole thing was like they fought very valiantly, but
seconds.
They knew that they were done for before it even started, but they decided to do it because somehow they knew that it was the only way. Essentially, it was a sort of do or die situation. And yeah, that's what I got.
Thank you, Comrade. Comrade, you have not spoken yet tonight. You have the floor.
Just to specify, was that the rebels or the British who were seen by the locals as heroes? And if
I can answer that.
I was just going to ask if the latter, why?
So that's the part that I was trying to remember is through the whole thing, the local population did not want this to happen, to put it simply. Not only did nobody cared when they read the proclamation, and the British were greeted as, hey, thanks for coming here to put down this BS that's happening in our hometown. I've read stuff that the locals were throwing vegetables at the rebel forces as they were fleeing under gunfire. And basically, the population was against an armed insurrection for national liberation. And this is the next part of the class, but up until the British came down so hard on them, the entire population, and the brutal executions,
Seconds.
that only then did the public opinion start to sway, where it was like, oh, these guys were actually onto something. They do something that we didn't. Maybe we need our own government. So, yeah.
Thank you. Another important thing to note that around this time, there was there was a local kind of House of Parliament, as they called it, that had been set up in Ireland, and this was mostly still at this point controlled by unionist or loyalist parties. There were some nationalist parties, but a lot of them were more focused on, hey, let's get a self-rule at this time. But like I said, the put down of the Easter Rebellion had a huge effect of actually swinging opinion of the public towards, hey, we actually need our own independent state.
So, yeah, Comrade Angelo is definitely right about how we should support national liberation movements from, Ireland to Gaza, wherever they happen, because, according to Lenin, there's two stages of revolution, and national liberation is the first stage, workers' revolution is the second stage, but you can't pursue socialism unless you're independent. So national liberation is very important, and we should support most national liberation movements.
Thank you, Comrade Chandler. Comrade Angelo, you have a follow-up to that?
Yeah. Remember, most revolutions go through dialectics like everything else in the world. So they change. What was true on Monday may not be true on Thursday. That's a basic tenet of Marxism, that things are constantly changing, and so are people. So it's difficult to keep something solid throughout. Second important point, in every revolution, we have found out that there's always been a third of the population who supported the oppressor. There's always been a third of the population who have been opposed to the oppressor. And there's one remaining third of the population who say, just leave me alone. We're not interested in real uprising or anything else. Nothing here is new to anything else. This is classic to 1776. Aptica wrote on this, Marxist historian Aptica, Herbert Aptica, and he goes into the whole thing. And that seems to be common in every revolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo.
Maybe, excuse me, I overlooked it, but how about just the casualties from bystanders? I think Comrade was mentioning a lot of the people were actually happy to see that this was over. but not to say it was one-sided. I'm just curious about like just the casualties that happened, broken buildings. We could think of current situations. That's all.
Well, one of the slides we have in the next section actually goes into the civilians dead and then the casualties, wounded, and all that execution. So hang tight for that.
I think again, my position is a question, and it's about the ethnic or racial composition of the United Kingdom and Ireland. Is there any reason for the British to feel that they are different from Ireland and from the Scotland? Because the Scottish people have also a history of tremendous exploitation by the British. So is there are there any racial differences between the Irish, the Scottish, and the British, except the dominance and exploitation by the British? And the second question is that what is this phenomenon called Anglo-American Empire or no, Anglo-Saxon? Is there a distinct, a separate race that can anthropologically be traced back to something equivalent to Anglo-Saxon? I like some explanations about those.
60 seconds. I see some hands popped up from that. Would you like to respond?
There's always a blend in all these geographical areas. I'll give you a perfect example. In Palestine, you cannot tell physically during the time of Jesus between followers of Jesus, Jews, and Palestinian Arabs. You couldn't tell the difference. They all look the same. They are Semitic people. Remember that. So to call a Palestinian anti-Semitic is a joke. He cannot be anti himself. You could say he's anti-Jewish, but you can't say he's anti-Semitic. And that's what the West does. They confuse the word. So in Palestine, you have different peoples who are fighting for the same land. I find it very similar to what went on in Ireland. I find it very similar if you study the indigenous peoples in the United States. Okay. You should do that studying. The different American tribes fight for the same land. They're all the same, but they're fighting for the same land. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we've kind of veered from the topic as well. So I see some other hands that popped up. And you have not spoken yet tonight. You have the floor.
To answer a little bit of Comrade's question, there is a little bit, well, when it comes to the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh, and like the Manish and all that, they're all part of the Celtic family. Irish and Scots particularly being Gael, but that's like a weird, they actually did kind of blend more. But the thing with the British, and that term is kind of loose really, because most of the time when people think of British oppression, they're really talking about the English. And English, Anglo, technically Anglo-Saxons are German, but that's like cousins long removed from the Roman era. But they've been in order, like, some people say that Britain itself could unite and possibly do that, but when it comes to Ireland itself, after 800 years, it's a kind of a hard sell to anybody for like the only people who are going to think that Ireland should be any part of the UK are Orangemen, which are basically the Protestant transfers and like the old colonial landlords, or people who have just been brought up and brainwashed into that kind of culture.
60 seconds.
All right, thank you. I'm going to try to answer part of the question kind of briefly, comparing Ireland to Scotland, and I'm going to reference what Comrade Angelo mentioned earlier, only for this point, that he mentions, oh, well, there's usually about a third of the population that supports the oppressors. In Scotland, that population quickly adopted the Industrial Revolution, which was happening in England about the same time that Scotland gets fully integrated into England as the original United Kingdom. So Scotland is going to industrialize very quickly. Their financial sector is going to merge with the English financial sector. So Edinburgh and Glasgow are very big financial centers, huge industry up there, coal, steel, everything that you could think of. Ireland is not developed as an industrial center outside of Belfast up until literally only a few years before this revolt, where Dublin starts to get a few industries, Cork, Limerick, but on a very small scale. And that is all controlled by British interests or the Anglo-Irish landowners or the Anglo-Irish elite. And part of that goes to a religious division, which we're not going to get into because that's a little off topic, but there is division between Catholic and Protestants in Ireland. Britain, especially England, was a very anti-Catholic country for a long time, so that affects that. There's a lot more I can go into, but that's the main gist.
Thank you, Comrade Cody. On that note as well, part of the debate over home rule before the Easter Rebellion broke out was the Ulster area around Belfast was industrialized, and that was very heavily unionist, but a lot of the unionists up there fear that if they had home rule, where suddenly they're going to get overrun by all these agrarian Catholics in the South, and that'll also infringe on their historic privileges as loyalist Protestants, whereas the agrarian Catholics were like, why are we being ruled by these absentee landlords? We need our own self-determination here. Coulter, did you want to respond to anything?
Yeah, so what said there would pretty much hit the nail on the head, because what I was going to say is I've been getting into Labor in Irish History, which is a work by James Connolly. And in it, he talks about how capitalism itself is a very alien thing to Ireland because it had such a rich history of basically a clan system that didn't really care about private property. And I'm just getting into this book, so I'm not going to speak much more on it because I can't, but that's a big reason why, is because the system of capitalism itself was very alien to Ireland.
Thank you, Comrade. Let's see. Comrade, you have the floor.
Yes. What the alliance between James Connolly troops, the Irish volunteer armies, and the Irish Republican Brotherhood with the People's Front or a Popular Front again? And also, why did the how did the public opinion change toward independence? Since initially, after the Easter Uprising, since initially the Dublin population welcomed British troops and everything. Also, what was that book Coulter was reading again?
So it was a popular front, and we'll be going into it in the next section. But as it was mentioned, for the most part, the population of this. Keep in mind as well, the Easter Rebellion really only took place in Dublin, even though the plan was, hey, we need to get all major cities, but that didn't happen. And a lot of the Dublin citizenry just saw this as a nuisance. And why are you doing this? And so that's why they welcomed the British, but then the British put down the leaders of it. And they treated them so horribly that it basically turned the tide of opinion towards the cause of the rebels. So
just one big difference between Scotland and Ireland is while they both have English as the largest and official language, they do have different languages in the sense that while both of them are called Gaelic and widely, Irish is called Gaelic in the actual language. Scots, I believe, is called Scots. And while they are vaguely mutually intelligible, they're also distinctly separate. Modern Israeli Jews are Ashkenazi and are very visually distinctive from Palestinians.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I wanted to add on to what Angelo had mentioned a bit earlier, where I think he said a third of the population was in support of the rising, or not, but just not the majority of the population is in the were in support of this uprising. And I think that's important to note because especially considering they employed a united front tactic. And I think it shows today for communists today to work with a united front. Many communists reject this idea, but obviously in conditions where we're not in the majority, just as the Irish, the Eastern people who participated in the Eastern Rebellion, they weren't in the majority. A united front was necessary to achieve what they aimed to.
Thank you, Elroy. Quick correction though. I think, Angelo, your comments were about revolutions in general, correct? Not the Easter Rebellion.
Right. It was in general. And I want you to know every revolutionary situation. Vietnam is the most example. You all have to understand that the majority of the people were not in the Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front. I was involved with that whole movement. The majority of the South Vietnamese were not in the NLF. That's a perfect example. A lot of them supported the Catholic Church. They supported the United States. They did not support the revolutionary movement. I think in every revolutionary situation, it's not monolithic. And I bet your bottoms to donuts, if you know what that word means, that in the Russian Revolution, there were large numbers of people who supported the Tsar, not just the aristocracy, but the Tsar was looked at as God. And therefore, they supported the Orthodox Church, who supported the God. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo. We do need to move on to the last section. So if you please keep your hands up for the next section.
Yep, thank you. City in ruins. 3,500 arrests, 1,400 in prison, 485 killed, 2,000 wounded, 15 executed. British losses were 120 killed and nearly 400 wounded. Irish volunteers and army citizen losses, 60 men, 180 civilians dead. The brief trials and executions were the galvanizing force to push for Irish independence. Thomas Clark, May 3rd, Edward Daly, May 4th. It's out of the way real quick. Joseph Plunkett, 4th May. Con Colbert, 8th May. Thomas Kent, 9 May. Roger Casement, 3rd August. Thomas McDonough, 3rd May. Michael O'Hanrahan, 4th May. John McBride, 5th May. Sean Houston, 8th May. Sean McDiarmada, 12th May. Padraig Pearse, 3rd May. William Pearse, 4th May. Eamon Keant, 8th May. Michael Mallon, 8th May. James Connolly, 12th May. Connolly's execution. Connolly was mortally wounded and would have died from his injuries in several days. His execution was needed to destroy his ideology as well as his person. Met his wife Lily and daughter Nora the evening before his execution. From Lily, "Your life, James, your beautiful life." From Connolly, "Well, Lily, hasn't it been a full life, and isn't this a good end?" Brought to firing squad via stretcher and tied to a chair or box for execution, face guns on his former comrades in arms. From Connolly, "I will say a prayer for all men who do their duty according to their lights." The aftermath. The rebellion had not a lot of support due to its small size, but the repression by the British galvanized Irish opinion towards the fallen. Coupled with the threat of mass conscription for fighting in World War I in 1918, the pro-Republican party, Sinn Féin, won majorities in elections that year. In 1919, they formed a breakaway government, Dáil Éireann, and declared an independent Ireland. Sinn Féin set its government at the Mansion House on January 21st, 1919, called the Áireacht. The Irish Citizen Army and Irish Volunteers were combined into the Irish Republic Army. The IRA fought with guerrilla tactics. Many cities, including Cork, were shelled and burned during the conflict. The Irish War of Independence lasted from 1919 until truces began in July 1921. Irish and English met for peace talks, which culminated in the Anglo-Irish Treaty signed on December 6th, 1921, which was later ratified by both Dáil Éireann and the Houses of Parliament. Set up at Ireland as a self-governing dominion of the British Empire called the Irish Free State. Northern Ireland would have the option of withdrawing from the Irish Free State within 1 month of the treaty signing, which was done. This led to splits between Dáil Éireann and the more militant IRA elements. A brief civil war came between free states versus more militant, and my apologies, I can't see that last word.
Says Republican forces.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for reading. I wanted to say that the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty was kind of also a place where a lot of Ireland's issues today kind of started, because while Michael Collins, who had led the IRA on against the British, was one of the signers, he had called this, well, let's set this as a bit of time to have some freedom so we can get true freedom. But many others saw this as a betrayal, since this treaty effectively split Ireland from 6 northern counties from the rest of the state. And other people were like, well, what have we fought for now? We wanted our own state, but now we're just this dominion within the British Empire. And then the Irish Free State itself existed until about 1949, when the Republic of Ireland was declared at that point. And then I see some other people had some hands up. Comrade Angelo, you have the floor.
Yeah, I think we should do a study of one of the vestiges of the British Empire is that their colonies wind up, when they got some type of independence, they wind up being split. I'm thinking about India and Pakistan. Perfect example. And it was done along religious lines. I see that in Ireland, along religious lines. I'm trying to think in Palestine. That was also British. Also, the Balfour Declaration, which came from England, it was dividing it along religious lines. It seems to be a tactic or something. It's an observation. Thank you.
Thank you. And also, the British had set up their own kind of coalition of independent states under our umbrella called the Commonwealth of Nations, that the Irish Free State was incorporated as one of these states, along with the same status of like New Zealand, Canada, India, and some others, where part of the treaty was you take a oath of loyalty to the new Irish Free State, and then you take a secondary loyalty to King George V.
And so was that really why in Northern Ireland they decided to stay with, I guess, the Union? Was it because of religious reasons, or was it more complicated than that?
It was a little more complicated than that, whereas, as mentioned earlier, Northeast Ireland had been a Unionist stronghold, especially around the Belfast, Ulster area. So a lot of this area had parties that had wanted to stay loyalist, or they wanted to basically be a part of England without any actual home rule. So when this happened, one of the provisions of the Anglo-Irish Treaty was, okay, so we're setting up the Irish Free State of all Ireland, but the Northern Ireland area, these 6 counties, they have the option of basically withdrawing from the Irish Free State and continuing the Act of Union that was set up in 1800 with the United Kingdom, which they did. But so this treaty itself was signed in December, but it wasn't for a couple months later. The Dáil Éireann actually, believe it or not, in secret, the night of January 6th, when they actually ratified this in 1922, after some public debates and hearings, the public, as a result, was very divided on this entire treaty, but they basically passed it in the night. So after that point, it became a struggle between elements within the Irish Free State. Like, okay, so the Irish Free State's a good option. We can go from there, versus more, no, we fought for an actual free Ireland, Republic of Ireland, or we fought for United Ireland. Why are we doing this? So you had a brief civil war that happened, and that set up a lot of the current issues that are going on in Ireland right now. All right. So I see some other hands that are up.
So I just wanted to add to one part there where, I mean, while I was going through this, especially the life of Connolly, is I found it. This might be a little extrapolation on my part, but I did find it strangely, I guess poetic might be the word, that here's a guy who joins the British Army when he's 14 to follow his brother. He also joined the Scottish Socialist Federation to follow his brother, and he ends up fighting the same force that he was a part of for those years. And then, and like, yeah, a lot of the forces in Ireland, like Connolly himself when he served, were just Irish working class people. So I found it very poetic that he was probably executed by his fellow Irishmen in uniform, but even to the death, he he said that line, "I will say a prayer for all men who do their duty." And I guess that just speaks volumes because he had spent his time in uniform, and to the death, he didn't even
90
judge his
seconds.
executioners because that's what soldiers do, is they just follow orders.
Thank you, comrade.
Yeah, small clarification just for if anybody doesn't know, the party's called Sinn Féin, SH, Sinn Féin. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade.
My question is on the Irish Civil War. What ultimately led to the defeat of the anti-treaty forces?
So supplies was one of them. They initially had some successes, but they were not as well equipped as the Irish Free State. They also did not have as much equipment or manpower to where eventually it became a wear down to where by 1923, 27, pretty much all of the pockets of militant Republican resistance had been wiped out by that point.
You covered most of what I wanted to say a little bit ago, but I was going to hop off that last bit. But after the 27, what you had is two groups. The IRA refers to the actual army as the Free State Army, some even to this day. But the regulars, which were what you'd think of as the IRA, they still existed in small forms or not throughout the 30s and the 40s. And it wasn't until the 50s where they got their more what you think of as like the Provo Troubles kind of era thing, even though it's still before them. In the 40s and the 30s, it was a combination of stuff like sending people to Spain, as well as there was something called the S Plan, which is more of the nationalist end, which is basically trying to sabotage Britain while they're at war with Germany, which for obvious reasons is a bad idea. But it wasn't up until the 50s and the 60s when they started getting more socialist, is when you see like the border wars and the troubles. But what really blew everything up was the riot of 69, which was a bunch of it wasn't just Protestants, but it was like their militias and stuff. They went around Belfast burning homes and churches. And after that, the IRA split into two. And that's pretty much where things got messy and a whole lot of bombs. And in the modern day,
90
Sinn
seconds.
Féin is, in the modern day, Sinn Féin is the shell of its former self. Social Democrats going to the king's coronation and all sorts of stuff like that. But that's all.
Fascinating.
Oh, yeah. What was that book that was reading again?
Yes, it is Labor in Irish History by James Connolly.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Yep.
Thank you, comrade. Comrade Chandler, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm just curious because my mom's side of the family is Scots Irish. How are Scots Irish people related to Irish people? I know most Scottish people are Presbyterians because that's the Church of Scotland is Presbyterian. But I'm just curious how Scots-Irish people are related, if anybody knows.
Okay. Cody, I see your hand went up at that. Did you want to respond?
Yes, real quick. So going back to this religious conflict, one of the solutions the English government came up with was what was known as the colony, which was trying to take Presbyterian Scots and move them into Ireland. And the area they moved was the closest area to Scotland, which is the Northeast. Hence why those 6 counties are very pro-unionist. They were Scottish Presbyterians who developed this very militant pro-British Union mentality. They do immigrate over to the U.S., so there's this big thing in American immigrant culture in the early years of like you're Irish from like the Great Famine years, from the terrible tragedies that are happening to that part of Ireland. They come later than groups like the Scotch Irish and the Scottish Highlanders, so they try to make these distinctions between these 2 different groups.
Thank you for that, comrade.
Thank you for watching this full-length class from the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. For more information or to join our free classes, visit our website, check out our YouTube, listen to our streams on Spotify, and chat with us on Reddit.